2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Tuesdays is always the day where we delve into Australian politics and politics globally with Professor Jim Jost. Good morning, Jim.
Morning, Mark.
But this morning we're going to sort of be a little bit broader. We're going to talk about electricity pricing and some of the federal government's reaction to that at the moment. Tell us a little bit more. What's been happening?
Well, what's happened is that the Prime Minister's announced a inquiry, I suppose. He's asked the ACCC, the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, to investigate and report back on electricity pricing around the country and to perhaps make some recommendations. Now, part of this, I think, is a demonstration that the government is in fact doing something. Mm-hmm. If you want to demonstrate to the voters that you've got things in hand, you announce an inquiry or a commission of some sort. But stepping back from that, come December last year, late December, about the 14th of December, the Australian Energy Market Commission brought down a report which pointed out that over the next 2 years, electricity prices are likely to rise by anywhere between $25 per kilowatt hour to $204. The only areas were, I think, was southeast Queensland and Tasmania where they weren't expected to rise. So this has put a bit of a prompt to the government to try and sort of deal with this.
It's interesting because you mentioned in Queensland they may not be rising at all, but for the rest of us, between $24 and $200, that is a massive disparity there of depending on where you live, isn't it?
Well, yes, and there are various reasons, and I think part of the issue is that we don't quite understand which reasons are really driving it, what are the causes here. And perhaps the ACCC will be able to identify some of those. It's difficult, though, I think, to know quite where Malcolm Turnbull and his government want to go on this, because we keep getting mixed messages about the government's approach to energy policy. We know that in the long haul, coal-fired generation of electricity is becoming less and less economical. We also know that in the long haul, the same is probably going to be true of gas-fired power generation. But in the meantime, we have to sort of find a way to move from where we are now to alternative forms of power generation.
It's interesting that you say that there is less interest for gas, because there seems to be has been a big push for gas in the last couple of years, hasn't there?
Well, yes, most definitely.
From the gas companies, of course.
And a lot of that has sort of been driven by export focus. But for the government, electricity is a really tricky area because it's a major cost driver, not just for consumers in terms of domestic consumers, but for industry, for businesses, what we might call the second-tier consumers, the small businesses and so forth. Electricity is a major component of the cost, and for some of these businesses it can be a really big cost to the point of being quite crippling for them.
So with that in mind, if we can jump back to the inquiry for a moment, being a bit cynical, particularly of politicians as we can be, is it a case of, well, we'll just put the inquiry out there and see what the public thinks of it? It is a case of we're seen to be doing something. I mean, there's been banking inquiries and many others. Could this be a case of we'll just have the inquiry and be seen to be doing something, but not necessarily taking the harsh measures that may need to happen to bring pricing into line with community expectations?
Well, without begging the question of what the Commission might come up with, there's probably something in what you say, that the Turnbull government is in trouble at the moment, as we've seen with the most recent opinion poll. So to be seen to be proactive on an issue is a good thing for them. To whether that proactivity will actually lead anywhere, I mean, within sort of the study of politics, there's a sort of cynical view, as you say, that you announce an inquiry and then everyone's happy and nothing really happens. But I think energy prices are one of those areas, Mark, where the government can't sit back and fiddle around. Eventually it's going to have to do something and perhaps set in place a more long-term policy and strategy. The problem at the moment is that the current government is very divided over a range of issues, and in particular around energy policy. And there's probably not enough of a consensus or the possibility of a consensus emerging in the coalition at present. It may be that a shock to the system may prompt a little bit more hard reflection, but the ACCC may provide that shock to the system, or it may be something more external. But eventually, we as a nation need to think about electricity in a much more strategic fashion. It's not just simply a commodity out there that we can pick and choose. And partly, at the moment, the government strategy, in addition to the ACCC option, is also the idea that if we just give consumers enough information, they will make the decisions that will drive the market into more efficient outcomes and cheaper prices. That is perhaps a little bit of wishful thinking in many respects, because even with perfect information, it's not necessarily the case that the producers will respond to the way in which the consumers might prefer. They will respond to where they see the profits, and it's not necessarily the case that the two areas will align in ways that will make it easier for the government to say that we've actually succeeded in getting the policy right.
So with some of those thoughts, Jim, a final thought for you. Could you see the end of this inquiry recommendations perhaps to move against a deregulated system that we have at the moment?
That's probably a bit too much of a stretch, but I suspect that they may have some recommendations that suggest a little more closely regulated system where the strategic decisions around electricity are taken much more seriously, rather than leave it to the market and self-regulation. Perhaps a little bit more setting of the policy parameters in ways that actually constrain the market in a positive fashion to ensure that electricity prices are both fair and reasonable, and producers are able to get their return on investment, but at the same time consumers are not being gouged or exploited in the process. Jim, tricky balance.
It is a tricky balance, and we'll see how the government happens to balance that out over the next weeks and months to come. Thank you, as always, Jim, for joining us.
My pleasure, Mark.
It is Professor Jim Jost talking politics and your electricity bill on 2NURFM 103.7.